Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So if you haven't seen the first two videos in this series where we actually started to prepare these panels for this video, make sure you go back and check those out if you're interested. But up until this point, we've spent our time milling some rough stock, and then in the last video we prepped these panels, the glued up panels, for doing our joinery in this video. And so we've got 4 panels all perfectly cut to their lengths, all perfectly matching in length, which is really important. And now we're going to start laying out our dovetails. So the most important thing anytime you're doing any kind of hand-cut joinery or joinery in general is you want to make sure you have everything prepped and ready to go. And so the next step before we can actually cut our joinery is to make sure we have all of our tools and equipment at the ready. So we want to make sure that when we're starting to cut our dovetails, we're not having to stop what we're doing to go grab a certain saw or a chisel or do something. We want to make sure that it's all sitting here ready to go so that you just kind of get in the rhythm of it and you're just going from tool to tool to tool until the job is done. Because you want, when you're doing stuff like dovetails, you want to just kind of get in a rhythm and stick with it for as long and as consistently as possible. So I'm going to get all my tools and stuff laid out here, and we're going to talk about a few of them here and there. Just so if you guys are new to dovetails, you can get a good understanding of it. I'm going to put it right at the beginning of the video here that I am not a professional when it comes to dovetails. Most of my dovetails still come out somewhat rough and I have a little bit of patchwork to them. But I think that I'm decent enough to show you guys my process for it. But if you want to learn from the masters, definitely check out Mike Pekovic. He has a video, a really good video about it on Fine Woodworking magazine. Also, Christian Sapp, he put out a really good video on YouTube about doing dovetails, and this guy is absolutely awesome at it. So there will be a link to his dovetail video down below, so you can check that out, and also try and put up in the card up there. So yeah, let's just get going with this. Okay, so I've got everything set up here. I've got all the basic tools I'm going to need laying out on my bench here. So we're going to go through these kind of quickly here. First off, obviously, you're going to need some kind of mallet to hit the chisels with when you're breaking stuff out. That one's kind of a given. Next up, we're going to need a few different size chisels. So I've got a 1/2 inch, 3/8, and 1/4 inch chisel here. I do have other sizes, and if I need them, I can grab them. But I'm pretty sure those are the only 3 that I'm going to need for doing this. Next up is a dovetail saw. So this is the Veritas dovetail saw with a little leather case that I made for it. I like the Veritas ones. They're probably not the best on the market, but they're fairly inexpensive as far as good Western or good back saws go. So it's a decent option to start with, and it's okay. I like it. The other saw we have is a new concept fret saw. Now this is a massive upgrade from the coping saw that I was using previously. That you'll see in some of my past videos. This, just because it's a fret saw, makes it a lot better, but the new concept ones are super lightweight, just kind of easy to use, and I really like them. The other little bits and pieces, we have a marking gauge, which is really helpful, a marking knife, a compass gauge marker, not sure what that thing is actually called, and then we have some dovetail angle markers. Now, I've got a few different ones here, so 1:6 ratio, 1:8 ratio, and 14 degree. Now, for hardwoods, I usually like to do the 1:8 ratio. That's kind of the norm for hardwood dovetails because they look pretty good too. When you start getting into your 1:6 and 14 degree, they become much steeper angles, and it's just a little bit too dramatic in my opinion on hardwood. So the 1:8 is a really nice ratio. And so all that I use these for is for laying out my dovetails. There are also quite a few different options on the market for dovetail guides. So I've got a straight guide here and a 14 degree dovetail guide here. And so there's lots of brands that make these. These ones are Veritas, but Jonathan Katz-Moses here on YouTube also makes his own dovetail guide, which is actually pretty nice from what I've seen of it. And all these do is they help you guide your saw when making the cut. Now, I found that after doing more and more practice, I don't like using these guides just because it's kind of like riding with training wheels. It's nice to start with, but eventually you want to get rid of the training wheels and just kind of go for it. And so if you're only cutting dovetails, once or twice a year on a project, then having these guides to really remind yourself how to set up the angles and do all that effectively is a fairly good option. But for me personally, I use dovetails quite often, and I prefer to practice without the guides, just because, again, it's like riding a bike with training wheels. You just kind of want to get rid of it eventually, so you don't have to spend the time setting up the guide and doing that constantly. So you can use guides. I don't prefer to, but again, when I started, I used guides, and they gave me pretty good results comparatively. So that's pretty much it. The last piece, and probably the most important for dovetailing, is you need a good quality vise. So you can see here, I've got a solid maple Moxon vise. And so as far as vices go, there's a few different ones that you can work with when you're doing woodworking. There's a bench vise, which is usually mounted to the side of your workbench. There's the typical metalworking vices that you see at, like, you can buy at Canadian Tire, Princess Auto, whatever, that are usually fairly cheap. And then finally, there's a Moxon vise. So a Moxon vise is really designed for dovetail work, because the benefit of a Moxon vise is you've got these two big hand wheels, and you can open the vise up a decently wide amount, and it keeps your workpiece at a nice working level. So if you were to try and do dovetails in your workbench vise, you end up being a little bit lower down. You have to hunch over more to do your cutting. Whereas here, I can actually be at a much more even level. Now, it also helps that I'm 6 feet tall, and this actually elevates the work up to a much more comfortable level for my shoulder. If you're a little bit shorter, then the bench vise would probably be just fine for you. But again, this just helps you do the layout and all that a little bit easier, and mainly it just helps you do the cutting easier. This is also a very firm vise to work in, and you can get a really good amount of clamping pressure to hold this piece of wood in there firmly. So I really like Moxon vices. They're very inexpensive to make. In total, I think this vise cost me about $150. 100 of that was for the actual hardware itself. It's all cast iron hardware, super top quality, and then I just bought a nice big chunk of 8/4 maple to make my two jaws. So again, it's something that you can make it as big or as small as you want, and you can really customize it for what you want to do with it, and they're just a really good thing to have in any kind of woodworking shop where you're planning to do any kind of hand-cut joinery, or just generally, I find them to be very useful. And so the next thing we want to do before we actually get to laying out and marking our dovetails is we want to choose our orientation of our case. Now, we already know the orientation of our case is it's going to be vertical, with the long sections on the verticals and the short sections on the top. And so this defines how we're going to be laying out our dovetails. And so the way dovetails work is you can kind of think of it like fingers here. The side pieces, kind of as they go down, they grip onto the horizontal pieces, and it just creates a friction joint. So it's super strong. Again, it's a very traditional joint. It's been used for hundreds of years because it's so strong and so good for what it's meant for. And so when you're planning out your dovetails, you want to make sure that you're working with the purpose of the dovetails. So on this case here, we want to make sure that we're putting the tails on the vertical pieces, so on the long sides. That way, as they are being pulled down by the weight of whatever's in the case or in the cabinet, they're going to be they're going to be working with the top panel to support the whole weight of this thing. And so it's a very simple thing to understand once you've cut dovetails once or twice. But when you're first looking at them, you're first thinking about doing them or working with them, it can be kind of confusing initially. All right, so the first thing you're going to want to do when you're planning to lay out your dovetails is you want to start by deciding how much you want to go in from either edge. So if you're fairly new to dovetails, how much you go in from the outside edges is what's going to define how big the gap is between your dovetails. Now, I've done a decent amount of practice with this, so I'm going to go with an 1/8 of an inch gap from the front, and then the back is going to be something a little bit different because we have that rabbet on there. And so you can use any flat reference surface to set up your marking gauge. You just want to make sure to double check it before you go for it. And I'm just going to put a nice simple scribe line across the front, just like that, so that it's very visible. And then I'm going to take my wing dividers, which is the proper terminology for these things, and I'm just going to roughly set it up to a size I think looks right, and I'm just going to walk it across my piece. And so I know that I want I know I want 5 tails on this thing. And so because of the rabbet, I want to make sure that this back tail just ends with a flat point. So I'm not going to be cutting the actual tail right anywhere near the rabbet. So the last tail is actually going to start somewhere around this area here. And so the trick here is to just kind of patiently walk your wing dividers along and make sure that they line up. And so this can be kind of tedious, but it is a very easy way to do it. Okay, so now we've got our wing divider set up, and so you can see that when I actually walk it across now, we end up with our point exactly touching the end here. It lines up pretty much perfectly with the end of the panel. And so now I want to make sure that I never change these for the rest of the setup here. Now, again, it's not a huge deal if you do but accidentally change it. You just got to reset them up. But if you want your tails to actually be consistent throughout all your panels, you just want to try your best not to manipulate these anymore or change them at all. And so when you have your wing divider set up, you're just going to go through and actually make the more permanent marks. So you're just going to walk along, put a nice big gouge, and it's fairly simple. You just want it deep enough so that your marking knife can actually get a grip in that little gouge. And so I like to mark the first side I do before I do flip the wing dividers around and mark the other side. And I want to go in 1/8 from the back side. So I'm just going to put a very shallow line on the back side and then just go through and make my marks. And then just like that, we have all of our, where we're going to be cutting all laid out. And so the next important thing we need to figure out is how deep we're actually needing to cut. So before we can actually draw our angles and all that on there, we need to figure out the depth. And so the best way to actually set your marking gauge to the proper depth is to just take one of your panels. I know I want a 1/16 of overhang, so I want the tails to be sticking out 1/16 of an inch. And all I'm going to do is just line it up. And again, make sure the panels are on a flat surface. Push your marking gauge down. And then you want to just always double check these, but you can see that on there with that, we're going to hold this piece, that side, and with a little bit of a balancing act, I can feel that we're perfectly lined up. The cutting edge of the marking gauge here is right on the edge of this piece of wood. And so same thing, you want, once you have your marking gauge set up, you want to, well, this you actually cannot change until the very end of the project. So you want to make sure that you lock it down nice and tight, and that you don't change it, because you want to make sure that this depth stays the same on all 4 panels when you're cutting either your pins, your tails. Doesn't really matter, they're all going to end up needing to be that same depth. And especially because I'm setting that 1/16 over, I want to make sure that I don't have to reset it up because it's just less accurate. And so to do this, you're going to end up having to take your panel out of the vise, and you just want to run the marking gauge just right down the edges. And you want a fairly deep impression on there because, again, you have to cut to this line and you have to be able to reference your saw in this line. So you want it to be a nice, deep, obvious cut in the wood. And so when you're marking out your tails, you're going to want to make sure that you do both inside and the outside of the panel, as well as the front edge, because you're going to be cutting this small portion off the front edge to give you that proper tail. And so with a sharp pencil and our 1:8 ratio dovetail guide, I can actually go in and start marking my lines. Now I like to mark them on both sides when I'm doing my first set of tails because I haven't done this in about a week or so. I just like to, on the first one, this is my time to really check and make sure that I'm keeping my angle perfectly straight. I'm keeping my angle perfect all the way down through the cutting of the tail. And so again, because this is my first time doing this in about a week or so, I want to make sure that I'm doing a bottom corner, because it's just less likely that people are going to look at the bottom corner. People are much more likely to inspect, top corners and that. And so again, always start, no matter what you're doing, no matter how long you've been doing dovetails for, generally you're going to want to start with either your bottom left or right corner, just somewhere in the bottom where people are less likely to look. And so our dovetails are now cut. So in total, that took me probably about 3 minutes. So anyone who says that dovetails are a super time-consuming joint generally hasn't actually worked with them that much. This part, I will admit, is quite fast, and so it's going to probably take me at least 20 minutes to get through the rest of all these, the other 3 corners. But this part, cutting the tails, is the easy part, like I mentioned earlier in the video. So the only thing left here to do is to actually go in and clear out the waste that's in between these, because I didn't cut all the way down to my baseline with my fret saw. I cut just a hair above it, so about a 32nd of an inch above that hairline, or above that baseline. And so now I just need to go into the chisel and clean that up. And so I'm gonna wait to do that until I've gotten all of the other 3 corners, all the tails cut. Then we'll go in and clean up those areas. But you can see here, this is a perfect example of aiming for good, but not trying to reach perfection. So if we do like that, you can see that it's not perfect. And again, it's not meant to be, but I'm pretty dang close to the angle I want to be. But what's most important is that those tails are straight across that face that I cut. And so just going through and checking them, most of them are fairly close. Really, we've only got this one back here that, no, that's not that one. Nope, never mind, they're all pretty good. And so if you're not aiming for a perfect joint, it's gonna relieve a lot of the stress that most people feel when they start trying to cut dovetails. I know I felt it when I started, and I just wanna make sure that everyone knows that you really don't have to worry about it that much, because again, you're doing a beautiful hand-cut joint. As soon as you tell people that this is a hand-cut joint, they're gonna be impressed. There's nothing, you don't really have to have them absolutely perfect, because 99% of people are never gonna know any better. Alright, so I've got my first panel set up in the box vise with this little 90-degree jig that I made out of just some MDF. Now, this is not a very good jig, but it's accurate enough for what I need. And so all I'm going to do is I'm just going to line them up, and I want to line up the baseline of the tails here with the back edge of the pinboard panel. And so this can be kind of tricky to do. Because we have that 1/16 of an inch offset, if you don't have any offset, if your pins and tails aren't sticking out at all, it's very easy to do it line these up, because you just flush up the 2 faces. But if you're doing any kind of overhang like I'm doing here, it becomes a little more complicated, because you can't just line up the 2 faces. You can't line up the end of this panel with the front edge of the panel that's in the clamp. You have to line up the baseline of this panel with the back edge of the panel that's in the clamp. And so with that set up in the jig, I like to put a clamp on it. I know this is not very common for a lot of woodworkers to do, but I'm very shaky with my hands sometimes, especially when I get nervous about cutting joinery like this. And so I like to just lightly put a clamp on it. And then once you have everything lined up, it's super easy. You just go in with your marking knife and just following the same angle as your tails, you just slice along. And you don't need to go, you want to go deep enough that you're cutting through the tape, but you don't need to go super deep, because you're not really trying to make a really deep mark in the wood. And so the biggest thing here is to just make sure you take the time to set these up properly. Alright, so now we have probably the best and the worst part of doing hand-cut dovetails is the first full case dry fit up. Now I know that all of the corners go together, now it's just a case of them actually working together to form the case. So what we're going to do is just very gently put these all in. And so anytime you're assembling dovetails or pretty much any joinery in general, at this phase of the game, you want to take it very slow and just be as gentle as possible with it. This is not the time to take out your mallet and start hammering. You want to be nice and delicate. So again, like I said, never using a mallet. You just always want to use your hand and just tap everything together. Perfect. Okay, so we're looking good overall. We've got a few small gaps on this side, which could just be caused by the dovetails not being perfectly cleaned up. So I'll have to go back in and check side or corner B here. But other than that, the entire case, the joints, the rest of them all look good. And so what we can do here, because I can see that the case is not fully seating, I'm just going to apply really, really light pressure with a clamp to just see if I can pull it together just like that. Beautiful. Does not normally work out that well. The nice thing about dovetails is that they're still a fairly loose joint. So you can go in, you can do light taps on the different corners to get everything squared up. And so what you're mostly checking for right now is that your front to back is square. That's kind of the most important thing, because that means that your panels are actually seating properly into the dovetails and everything's good. So once I know that this one corner, so my bottom left corner in this case, I know is perfect. I can see on the back side here, or on the front side of the case, we're perfectly 90 degrees. On the back side, we're also perfectly 90 degrees, so that I know is a really good joint. Now I can go and base everything else off of that joint. And so just by applying that little bit of clamping pressure to the case, we've actually managed to get everything mostly cleared up. So everything is definitely square enough to fit in everything we're going to need to fit in here. All right, so now that we've got everything fit up nicely, everything is coming out as mostly square as it actually needs to be. We're pretty much good to go on to the next phase of this thing, which is going to be putting in the shelves. So we've got the top shelf and the bottom two shelves that we're going to be putting in the next video. This is going to be a pretty interesting thing because our bottom shelves are built with a frame design. But yeah, that's all going to be in the next video. So I do hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I will see you in the next one.